Hi, this is Paul. This is not the second part of the video I planned on Noel Plum's Jordan Peterson Destroys Christianity, but it is sort of a second part of it. And I played some of this in the video I put up yesterday, and I'll put the link to it in the comments, where he basically says Jordan Peterson is just another guy who's giving wisdom out of the Bible, and this is exactly what the Church of England does, and that's what destroys Christianity. And I thought, no, that's not who Jordan Peterson is, but yes, that does destroy Christianity. And then, thanks to the Google algorithm, I know the Google algorithm has brought a bunch of you people to me. Well, for some reason, it popped up this video, and this is Greta Vosper, who is well known in the United Church of Canada. I believe she's been kicked out because she was an atheist, and she was speaking at this clergy project, which is American Humanist Association that tries to support clergy who are atheists. You know, there's a group for everything. And I listened to this part of the presentation, the speech she gave, and I thought it impacted. I thought this is exactly what Noel Plum is describing destroys Christianity. And I've been spending a lot of time lately on the question of how do words orient us? Because I'm what's called a synodical deputy for my denomination, and I've been attending other classis meetings, listening to a lot of clergy exams, and we listen to clergy giving doctrinal answers to things. And there was a comment in one of my videos where someone said, well, I want a non-creedal church. And so I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between these words that we use and belief, and why these words are important, and why creedal formulations are important, and how this orients us in the world. And when I saw this video of Greta Vosper, I thought this is exactly an example of how our words orient us in the world and why they're vitally important. So let's listen.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you today and to be able to share a bit of the story. I am indeed a pastor in a United Church of Canada congregation. It's not a congregation that has been taken out of a mainline denomination, but one that continues to exist within the United Church of Canada. It's in the city of Toronto, a congregation which this year is celebrating its 65th anniversary.
Now, this is 2015, and I believe she was kicked out of the church in 2017 or 2018. John Sook, who was a former CRC pastor who also pastors a church in Toronto, had written a blog post about her, and if I remember, I can put the link to that in the comments here too.
I've been there for 18 years. About 15 years ago, a colleague of mine, while on a Habitat for Humanity build in another province, was caught in a hurricane with his 2-year-old son in his arms. His son was torn from his arms and killed during that hurricane. I heard about that and so went searching on the internet for something about the information that I could learn, and the headline that came up was a picture of a family with a child, and the headline, "God took care of us." And that was the last straw, because I could no longer use the word God to describe what I meant and allow it to be understood to mean what so many other people mean, the Wikipedia definition of God. My definition of God, since I had been very young, was about love. It was about creating something very sacred between you and I. It was about making sure that I didn't just use people, and that I allowed myself to build relationships with them that meant that they would honor my integrity and they would not just use me.
Now, when she used this definition of God, I thought, I wonder if she was sitting across from Sam Harris, what Sam Harris would say to this. He would probably jump on her like he jumped on Jordan Peterson. Well, that's not God. Well, let's hear her continue to talk.
It was about trying to build that relationship in the world, a world that was so in need of compassion and justice and caring and beauty. And so my ministry grew out of that, and I used the word God to describe that. But over the course of a few years in ministry, I clued into the fact that nobody had any idea what I was talking about. And I worried about that. I didn't really understand why that was happening. A colleague and I actually had a conversation about it one time. And the next Sunday, when I sat down at the front of my congregation and I opened my bulletin, I realized everything I said in that 20 minutes of preaching, during which I did what I had been taught in theological college, where I learned that the Bible was a human construction. I was taught to take the Bible passage for the week apart, to talk about the socio-political, economic environment in which it had grown out of, who wrote it, why they wrote it, who they wrote it for, why the context of that piece had absolutely nothing to do with today. And then I'd find...
Which is exactly what a lot of theological seminaries will teach you. And what's interesting is that Peterson talks about the Bible coming, okay, he's from below, but in a way, how she describes it, what Jonathan Peugeot had a tweet a few days ago about biblical scholars not being very helpful in terms of growth, in terms of spiritual growth. And I was a little sensitive to that comment, but also understood the comment. And in a sense, that's what she's describing, because over the last 150 years, a lot of energy has gone into biblical scholarship to basically try to distance us from the Bible in an attempt to avoid facile associations with the Bible. And again, this is part of what Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris was talking about in their conversations, because Sam was saying, well, you can get anything from the Bible. And Peterson said, yeah, but you can get anything from events too. And so the question then is trying to figure out what exactly the Bible is speaking about. And you can get into issues like authorial intent, context, so on and so forth. But again, Greta Vosper was talking about the fact that in probably her liberal theological education, she had been taught all of this biblical studies, but at some point you'd have to ask, well, why? And this is exactly where she's going with this.
Some little thing, and I, build some moral something around it. But no one heard any of that.
She builds some little moral something around it. This is exactly what Noel Plum is talking about. Here's something in the Bible. Let's look at it. Here's our little moral lesson. Here's your little moral lesson. But you can, and there are a few churches out there like this, that they're deriving moral lessons from all sorts of things. You can derive moral lessons from movies. You can derive moral lessons from great pieces of fiction. You can derive moral lessons from crappy fiction. You can derive moral lessons from sitting in your car and having an idea and then phoning your friend and telling them your idea. Moral lessons come. It's nothing wrong with it. It just is what it is.
Because I wrapped it entirely in traditional sounding prayers. Oh God, in your mercy, hear our prayer. We sang hymns that held up this idea of Jesus that would, conquer the world.
Language orients us. And so here she is, a preacher in the United Church of Canada, using all of this traditional language because it's in the liturgy, but not believing any of it, and now suddenly surprised that her congregation, even amidst plenty of conflict, still does.
And we spoke in language that reinforced the idea of an interventionist supernatural deity that was going to, if nothing else, be the only and sole source of our strength. So I realized that something had to give, but I didn't know what. So I pondered it for a little while, and that's when the hurricane took place. So one Sunday, unprepared.
I believe that is a metaphorical hurricane she's referring to.
Those of you who have been clergy know that things happen and you don't get a sermon done for the Sunday. And most clergy, if that happens, they've got a drawer, they pull out a file of a sermon they haven't preached in a few years, or they preached at another church. I don't write my sermons. I didn't have a drawer. So the service unfolded, and when it came to the time when I was supposed to preach, I stood up and I completely deconstructed God. I talked about how I couldn't possibly believe in an interventionist God, that I couldn't abide that there but for the grace of God go I statement, that I could no longer talk about a supernatural realm that would or would not in-break into ours in order to adjust natural events, that I didn't believe that you and you and you didn't stand with courage and strength coming out of your own self and not from some other place.
See, and right there is a very interesting, are those two things antithetical? You're saying they're either or and not both and.
At the end of that sermon, I think it was that sermon, was the moment that I realized things had changed forever. I sat down, picked up my bulletin, and realized the next thing, the intercessory prayers. I had to stand and say, "Oh God, in your mercy," and they had to respond, "Hear our prayer." But after that service, I got more hugs than I had ever had in my entire life as a clergy. Not because people were going, "Yes, we totally believe that." They thought I'd had some kind of a psychotic break. But I knew that I had stepped over a line. And so I met with the chair of my board, and we called a board meeting, and we had the conversation. And I said, "I just can't do this anymore." I thought I was in the middle of a spiritual crisis, but I recognized now it was a leadership crisis. My beliefs hadn't changed at all. I just realized I couldn't lead anymore like that. And so they said, "Okay, tell us what it's going to look like. Where are we going?" And I said, "I haven't got a clue. I don't know." And they said, "Okay, let's go." 15 years later, we're still transitioning that congregation, but I think we've got it pretty good now. For the first little while, people were all on board, moving along, very supportive until shortly after my first book, With or Without God, Why the Way We Live is More Important Than What We Believe, was published. We finally took the Lord's Prayer out. Whew, that had been a long time. We lost 50% of the congregation when we did that. It was no surprise.
It shouldn't be a surprise. We finally took the Lord's Prayer out. Okay. Well, this is I watched this and I thought I almost don't have to make comments about this. And but in terms of my thinking, well, what does language do? How does language relate? Well, it orients us. Well, you take out the Lord's Prayer, well, you might as well take out any prayer, because you're talking to each other then. Nested in this thing is God number two, that you're sitting at the side of your bed, and it's what Peterson and Harris talked about in Vancouver 1. You're sitting at the side of the bed, and you know you've done something wrong, and you ask, you don't know what. Well, hey, baby, it's called prayer. And if you send a letter up, it's God's mailbox.
But before we make decisions like that, we have a congregational meeting or a board meeting, and we say, this is what we're going to do, this is going to be the cost. And we assess whether or not we're willing to accept that cost. And never once have the leaders of that congregation shirked their responsibilities and said, "No, this will cost us too much, we can't do this." And so they have continued to move forward, sometimes at a pace that outstrips my own, doing things and making change that I would have a more pastoral.
And I'm assuming she's basically saying continuing to deconstruct any of this
Response to.
And this is exactly why, for me, this is Jordan Peterson is not what Noel Plum thinks. What she is describing here is the opposite of Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is doing this in reverse. And that's why, well, that's why Noel Plum, although he's right about the Church of England and its difficulties, and he's right about what you're seeing here is the death of the church, Jordan Peterson, that's not that. Steve Martin was on David Letterman a number of years ago with an album that he did, and I'm not going to play this because I'm sure CBS would tag this video right away, but Atheists Have No Songs. But then in my conversation with Alex the other day, he told me about his former music pastor, and then he sent me the link to it, and
I think it's entitled
and I listened to this, and every time I've listened, this will be the third or fourth time I've listened to this, and it's just shocking. And I think, well, This is why you don't have any music. Just listen to this.
Liberating hymns, right? So we're going to do one of those.
Liberating hymns. And some of you might have caught the tweet I had about the Quillette article today on Zizek and Peterson and their difference, and this liberationism, which it's essentially a liberationism from anything that might stand against our power. And that story that so rocked Greta Vosper's faith, well, I don't know if that's exactly the right narrative for her, but here is one child is taken and one child is saved. This is human life. This is part of the reason the Bible is the shape it has. And so you fix it by getting rid of God. Please tell me what that fixes. Does that mean, now both parents are going to, if they're good and loving parents, they're going to do anything within their human power to save their child, anything that science and technology could give them. This is not an either or operation here. The God of redemption in Christianity is the God of creation. And the Belgic Confessions we see through 2 books, General and Special Revelation. There's nothing new in Christianity. And of course, science comes out of Christianity in the West. But then I hear this song and I think, and this is liberation? Please tell me what you're being liberated to.
Those for you just now. I sent Dan a bunch of music and I said, I've got some ideas. I'd like to rewrite some of the words to some of the hymns that he and I both knew so well for so many years. And so we picked one we're going to do for you tonight, and it's called The Solid Rock. If you were in the church and you knew it, the chorus went, on Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand.
Which is from the Sermon on the Mount, roughly.
All other ground is sinking sand. The new title of this song is called The Solid Rock of Science. My hope is built on nothing less than facts learned from hypothesis. I dare not trust the sweetest myth, but wholly trust in science. On science, the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When problems rear their ugly face, I trust minds of the human race. When all around my soul gives way, knowledge is my true hope today. On science, the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When we are sick and prayers all fail, medicine can cure our ails. I do not trust in God's good grace. Real hope is found in science. On science, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand.
Religion is corrosive to science. It teaches people to be satisfied with trivial, supernatural...
Okay, I can't take it anymore. In the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris talk, they're talking about your hand in the fire on a hot stove, you pull it out. Well, that's right. That's right. But the question is, what happens? What can lead you to keep your hand in the fire? Well, it's meaning, and there's a necessity, because yes, take medicine. Yes, So you listen to that, and you think, oh, this is what Jordan Peterson is. That Jordan Peterson is just giving pearls of wisdom out of the Bible and out of everything else. It doesn't really match with who he is. Now, this is from a podcast in 2017.
This sculpture, and I spent like 4 months on it. I was thinking about it a lot, and I got it mostly assembled, and then I was in my living room in Montreal, and I was listening to Mozart's Fourth Symphony, the Jupiter Symphony, and I was really listening to it, and it's one of these complexly multi-level patterned pieces of auditory sculpture that I believe represents being, because what being is multiple levels of patterned transformation interacting simultaneously. And music is a representation of that, which is why I think we find it meaningful. Anyways, wow. I was listening intently to this symphony, and at the same time I was concentrating on the sculpture that I had made, and all of a sudden, and everything I'm about to say is a metaphor because there's no way of encapsulating it properly in words, but it was as if the heavens opened up above me. I mean,
and now again, pay attention how language orients.
I was still in my living room, but
yes,
the experience is best represented by one of those early Renaissance paintings where you see God or Christ up in the sky with an opening in the sky against the clouds and against the sun. So it was like that, even though I didn't really see that, but it felt like that. And there were some visuals that were associated with it. And I felt something descend upon me that had a personal nature, something like what you were describing as a higher consciousness that was actually a being of a sort. And it filled me from the inside out. And I had and it was enrapturing, let's say. And it was an incredible feeling. I mean, it was a divine feeling, I suppose, is the right way of thinking about it. It was certainly a religious experience. And it transformed me, and it turned me into something far more than I normally was. And maybe you could think about that as an intimation of what you could become if you worked on it for the rest of your life, which sometimes I think is what hallucinogens provide people with, is an image of who they could be if they shed all of their deadwood.
Right.
Anyways, it was as if an offer was being made to me that I could be like that from now on permanently. And I thought, well, I don't know how to do that. I couldn't walk down the street in this condition, in this elevated condition. I wouldn't belong in the world anymore. I wouldn't know how to function. I don't know how I could do it. And so this experience, this thing, say, that was communicating with me was accepted that as an answer, although I would say with some sorrow, and then it receded. And then I went and talked to my wife, and I told her what had happened, and I was shaking a lot, and like a tremendous amount, and my pupils were completely dilated.
Wow.
Yeah, and that happened to me one other time in a similar manner, although it was more like an echo. It wasn't quite as intense, but I was concentrating very much on trying to understand the meaning, the central meaning of music, and of course the phenomena of meaning itself. And it seemed like the combination of that intense concentration and the visual stimulation and the music all culminated to produce this transformation of consciousness, but that was its nature. And so I talked to an old neuroscientist that I knew at that point. His name was Frank Irvin. He was a very interesting and wise character. And, I found out that those sorts of experiences are often reported by people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, for example. Just before they have a seizure, they have this experience called an aura. Dostoevsky had those, and they're often accompanied by this sense of massive opening up of consciousness. But I didn't have a seizure, and I don't have any signs of epilepsy or anything like that. So I guess it was an analog. It was an analogical explanation. I mean, there have been neurological investigations that show that stimulating certain parts of the brain can reliably produce let's say, mystical experiences.
Sure. I know. But really what happened?
And then the Duncan Trussell, I guess that's who it is then going to wade in with his interpretation. And, well, here's the thing. There's a story. Are you going to wade in with an interpretation? How do you know? How can you explain it? And I think a lot of the, pointing to the fact that Dostoevsky wasn't, had epilepsy is not really different from pointing to the fact that Shaquille O'Neal is big. It's how he's wired. It's how he is. Peterson is not similar to Greta Vosper. Peterson is not similar to people who are giving explanations in order to dispel a God that they are offended by, or language of God that they are offended by, of trying to, in a sense, when I had God number one and God number two, you cannot read the Bible and imagine God is tame. This is what C.S. Lewis gets at in the Narnia Chronicles. God is not a tame lion. Why does God tell Moses, you can't see my face, I'm going to put you in the cleft of the rock, and then I will pass by you with my back, because if you'd see any more of that from me, it would destroy you. And we think, well, why would that be? Well, someone who hasn't had an experience like Peterson just described, and again, don't read interpretation into what I'm saying here in terms of that experience. I cannot interpret that experience. It's always tempting to interpret that experience, but the desire to interpret it expresses a desire to, in a sense, box it and contain it and dismiss it. I can't interpret that experience. I wasn't there. As a pastor, I have had people come and tell me experiences similar to it. Now, people don't share these experiences in public often because other people think less of them. They lose status because of it. And it's frankly amazing that Peterson is willing to talk about such experiences so publicly, because again, people hear this and say, well, he's clearly mentally ill. Here's the thing. Everyone will judge you according to their own standards, no matter what you do. But experiences such as this are not uncommon. They are experiences. Treat them as data. Resist interpreting them. But I'll offer two more. These are from Tim Keller's book on prayer. Blaise Pascal was a Christian believer and philosopher and one of the greatest minds of history. When he died, it was discovered that he had sewn into the inner lining of his coat the description of an experience he had had one night. It read, in the year 1654, Monday, 23rd November, from about 10:30 in the evening until half an hour after midnight, fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, and not of the philosophers and of learning. Certainty, feeling, joy, peace. Pascal was not talking about the sight of literal flames, but of an experience of the presence of God, that fire in the Bible so often represents. He believed in God, but when he said he had met the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the God of the philosophers, he meant he now knew in the heart that what he had known in abstract. I kid you not, as I was preparing this, someone called me and shared with me stories about their life and talked with me about sometimes you have experiences and the ability to sit on the fence about God number two is taken from you. And that is not a small thing. Because suddenly, if you know down deep in your soul that God is real, now you have to decide what to do with him and about him. And that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, an enormous burden. And in many ways, the hiddenness of God in this world is an expression of God's mercy. Because what we really want to do is rebel. We really don't want to believe that there is a God who chooses. We really don't want to believe that there is a God who selects. We really don't want to believe that God gives and takes away. We really don't want to believe that God could be an author and we characters in our stories, and he brings things into our lives. Read the Heidelberg Catechism on providence. He brings things into our lives, good years, lean years and fat years, hard times and good times, that God in fact chooses and decides. And it is just as inappropriate often to lean in with some schmaltzy Christianish, well, God needed another angel. We say things like that to distance ourselves from God, to distance ourselves from our smallness and his greatness. And in the book of Job, when Job, after suffering horrendous loss, goes on chapter after chapter demanding to meet God face to face, and God shows up and shows himself and says, Job, what really do you have to say? And Job says, I put my hand over my mouth. Another story, Dwight L. Moody, from the same book from Tim Keller. Another less famous example is Dwight L. Moody, a prominent Chicago minister and evangelist in the late 19th century. He wrote, one day in the city of New York, oh, what a day. I cannot describe it. I seldom refer to it. It's almost too scary an experience to name. I can only say that God revealed himself to me, and I had such an experience of his love that I had to ask him to stay his hand. It wasn't that Moody was not a Christian or that he had never known Christ's love and presence. Perhaps we could say that the objective reality of who he was in Christ and the inward subjective experience came together. For a moment, he lived as the person he actually was. Jordan Peterson is just a guy out there telling moral stories from the Bible. Are you paying attention? From how I see it, Jordan Peterson, this isn't the only mystical experience Jordan Peterson talks about. From how I see it, Jordan Peterson is trying to put things together for himself because he cannot deny this experience. And go ahead and talk to other people who've had experiences like this. It doesn't mean that they all become Christians. This is a very interesting book I read a number of years ago, Living with a Wild God by Barbara Ehrenreich. She had written Nickel and Dimed, and she talks about the experiences that she had. And when you want to, okay, if you're a materialist, you want to chalk it up to brain stuff. Okay, she's an unbeliever. She doesn't believe. The thing is, once you live through these things, you then have to live with them. It's just true. It's just real. And again, sometimes Christians have a hard time with this. Christians have a hard time with this. But there's nothing in Christian theology that says this isn't real or this isn't true. Now, again, the interpretation you ought to be quite humble about. Is this God? Is this something else? Spiritual forces? I'm a Christian believer. I believe in spiritual forces. I believe in principalities and powers. This world is far larger and far stranger than we can imagine. And when we read about it with Blaise Pascal and Dwight Moody, well, then it's easier for us. But Jordan Peterson, well, he has all the signs that he is working his stuff out. And yeah. So these are his experiences, and he has other visions that he shares. This is how he is. This is not this. It's very different. This is the death of Christianity. This and this and this. Anyone who reads the Bible, the wild parts of the Bible that says God is so big and so vast that God could make a universe like this. This is, as Tim Keller referred to with, oh no, I can't remember her name. This is not the kind of God you ask to be your assistant. But this is a God of power, and this is a God of love, and we don't know how to keep those two things together. And when tragedies come upon us, the death of a child, needless death that seems just absolutely pointless. No Graven Image, that's the name of the book I'm thinking of. This is, why can't I think of her name? Elizabeth Elliot. That's whose name I'm trying to think of. Here's another one of my go-to books, because here's the thing. We imagine that somehow we can deal with the crisis better, the crisis of loss, the crisis of chaos, the crisis of why didn't God step in and rescue when this horrible thing was happening? How could God allow this? Corrie ten Boom in The Hiding Place. If you've never read that book, read that book. Wonderful Christian woman, wonderful Christian family. Her sister was a saint. They were hiding Jews from the Germans. They get caught. They go to the camp. And her sister dies in the camp. And afterwards, she goes around Europe preaching. And she goes on an evangelistic crusade to Germany. And what does she have to face? I continue to speak partly because the home in Bloemendaal ran on contributions, partly because of the hunger for Betsy's story seemed to increase with time. I traveled all over Holland, to all their parts of Europe, to the United States. But the place where the hunger was greatest was Germany. Germany was a land in ruin, cities of ashes and rubble. But more terrifying still, minds and hearts of ashes. Just across the border was to feel the great weight that hung over that land. It was a church service in Munich that I saw him, the former SS man who had stood guard at the shower door in the processing center of Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers that I had seen at the time. Then suddenly it was all there, a room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, Betsy's pain-blanched face, that was her sister. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. "How grateful I am for your message, Fraulein," he said. "To think that, as you say, he washed my sins away." His hand was thrust out to shake mine, and I, who had preached so often to the people of Bloemendaal the need to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask for more? "Lord Jesus," I prayed, "forgive me, then help me to forgive him." I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand. I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again I breathed the silent prayer, "Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness." As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder, along my arm, and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it is not our forgiveness any more than our goodness that the world's healing hinged, but on his. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command, the love itself. What offends us is God's resistance to our will and our lack of power to instill or inflict our will on nature and other human beings. This world is a story God is writing, and it's a good story. It's a story with a happy ending. And you have a role in it, and you have a part in it. You're a character. And both in the movie and in the movie in The Lord of the Rings, Sam, and in the book too, Sam wonders why the drama, why the suffering, why the seeming chaotic, senseless loss in this world. Don't play chicken with God. He's the kind of author that is writing a story, the best kind of story, the story that keeps us at the edge of our seat. But he is love, and he is power, and he does choose, and he does save. This God, well, he doesn't exempt his son from any of this. And yet his son rises from the dead. And then people say to me, yeah, but Jesus knew he was going to rise from the dead. Well, that's exactly what he promises you. Do you think it was any easier for Jesus to believe it would happen than for us to believe when we have the testimony that one has? So, yeah. Jordan Peterson destroying Christianity because he's just telling stories with tidbits of wisdom in it. That's not Jordan Peterson. I don't buy it for a minute.